Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about Harman Phoenix II, the highly anticipated second generation color film from Harman Photo. Let's get into it. Full disclosure, the folks at Harman Photo sent me a bunch of rolls of Harman Phoenix II so I could produce content about the film following on from my series last year, and I did also get to recently tour the factory at Mobberley where I got to see Phoenix II being produced. And I'll talk about the factory tour another day, but while I was there, I got a couple of little bit of tidbits of information to help demonstrate the performance benefits over the original Phoenix and best equip you to shoot it. I do of course have other things in the works, but this video is just going to be a general first impressions about the film as it's kind of intended to be shot. The Phoenix project is an initiative from Harman Photo, a spin-out of the Harman Technology brand, the same company that owns Ilford Photo, and their goal is the rebirth of British colour film manufacturing. Their first product was Harman Phoenix, released in late 2023, which was essentially chemically jury-rigged from Ilford's XP2 into an actual colour film, and that was the sole goal at that point, to produce a colour film. And for all of the flaws the original Phoenix emulsion had, they did succeed in producing a colour film. This time around, they have made a number of improvements and they have kept their promises modest and worked slowly and quietly to avoid the risk of overpromising and not being able to deliver on those promises, which, although definitely a bit frustrating as a customer at times when you want them to have new things that you can try, is more understandable than saying we're going to make, Harman Chrome 1600T and 8x10 next month, and then obviously that never comes to pass. The original Phoenix emulsion was by no means a finished product, and it has a lot of weaknesses, like very strong grain, very high contrast, very limited dynamic range, and very narrow exposure latitude, meaning you can't over or underexpose it very much, as well as colors that are generally very pleasing and quite iconic at this point to a lot of people, but to be fair, objectively not very faithful in reproducing a lot of shades. But arguably the biggest issue with Phoenix is its sensitivity to different ways of scanning it, which is something that Harman have tried to work on with this new emulsion, because if you took Phoenix 1 and you DSLR scanned it, flatbed scanned it, stuck it in a Frontier, stuck it in an Aritsu, you would get 4 completely different looks. And it was often said that the worst thing you could do with Phoenix 1 was send it off for lab scans with people who weren't familiar with the film, which, to be fair, is what the vast majority of the customer base are going to do. Harman Phoenix II then represents a massive step in the right direction, tackling each of these weaknesses to varying degrees to produce an overall much more highly performant film. The goal now appears to be to produce a higher quality ISO 200 film before branching out to other different types of film, in much the same way that you would improve as a musician by practicing the same song over and over until you're good at that song, and then you try other genres or other paces or styles of music. The list of improvements with Phoenix 2 include improved color reproduction, much more controlled contrast, reduced grain, increased sharpness and resolution, broader exposure latitude, and greater suitability for lab scanning, especially when using default settings rather than needing a custom profile. Harman Photo also say that the film has been redesigned from the ground up and completely rebuilt with all new couplers and all new dies, with a unique layer structure that will have a certain impact that I'll touch on later on. The boxes follow the overall design language of those for Phoenix 1, with the same gradient and a glossy finish to the Phoenix logo, though this time in a blue colorway that will make a bit more sense soon. Phoenix 2 is available in both formats right off the bat, so if you massively preferred the original Phoenix in 120, you don't have to wait this time around. The 35mm rolls are loaded into metal canisters containing 36 exposures each, bearing a DX code for the box speed of 200 to communicate the frame count and ISO to your camera. In 120 medium format, the number of exposures you can get per roll will depend on the format of the camera that you use. The emulsion is coated onto a low-density acetate base, looking more olive green on the backside and yellow rather than yellow-green on the emulsion side. As with Phoenix 1, there is no anti-halation layer present, and as I mentioned, there is a novel, unique layer structure to this film, which is something I'm not sure about the details of and I'm trying to get information on, but I'm told will make this film somewhat unsuitable for red scaling. With a retail price to match the original Phoenix, it is still a bit more expensive than many competing films, but Harman do need to recoup their R&D costs for each generation over a smaller number of rolls. You think about Kodak Gold, that was kind of a solved problem a lot of years ago, and now they've kind of recouped those costs. But also Harman are aggressively reinvesting the revenue and profits from the Phoenix project into further redevelopment, and it definitely shows with Phoenix 2 versus Phoenix 1. And lastly, of course, this is a color negative film designed for development in the standard C41 chemical process that yields negatives, which must be inverted either during printing or scanning to get your final positive images. The biggest thing for me is the vastly improved resolution. The crux of my Mastering Phoenix project last year was finding a way to keep the look of Phoenix while reducing the grain and improving resolution. And that's what you've got straight out of the box here. Comparing a digital shot to Phoenix 1 and Phoenix 2, and then cropping in quite heavily, Phoenix 2 is able to resolve a tremendous amount more detail, even with standard C41 processing, than the original emulsion could. And the claims of lower contrast and improved color reproduction are definitely true here as well. Even though both of these emulsions respond well to camera scanning, I've gotten much nicer results straight out of the box with Negative Lab Pro with Phoenix 2 than with Phoenix 1. Looking at the color charts, the mixed colors like orange yellow and yellow green all match the chart a lot better. Basically any mixed color, especially those including yellow, but even some of the blues look quite nicer as well. There's also somewhat reduced saturation as the color reproduction is more even across the chart without a massive bias towards the red and green, giving a slightly more muted look that leans somewhat cooler overall, hence the blue theme for the packaging. It isn't a perfect color chart, but it's still definitely a large improvement. And yes, we also see significantly reduced grain compared to the first generation film. My test shots are not a perfect one-to-one because for the first time since November 2023, I've actually run out of Phoenix. I've shot it all recently on a couple of recent trips, not restocked yet. So when I was doing my side-by-sides, I had to reuse images from another day where the lighting setup was not exactly the same. But instead, if we look at some real-world images, you can very clearly see that yes, Phoenix 2 presents with noticeably finer and less abundant grain than the original emulsion does. Though the improvements to resolution and grain are absolutely very significant, they're more about the results. But there's another big improvement from a general usability standpoint, and that is the exposure latitude, which has been improved somewhat. The original Phoenix required you to be pretty much bang on with your exposure. If you underexposed or overexposed to stop, you were going to see very noticeable differences. And if we look here across a range of EIs, even though Phoenix 2 doesn't tolerate it quite as well as some other films, especially overexposure is tolerated quite a lot better than Phoenix 1, retaining a lot more highlight detail with the whites not being completely washed out, and there's distinctly better retention of detail when overexposing. That said, when you underexpose, you do see slightly better retention of shadow detail, but it isn't very significant, and neither one of these films particularly performs well here. Lastly, one of the things I picked up in the factory is that the true ISO of this emulsion is somewhere between 160 and 200. Harman Phoenix 1 had a box speed of 200 because you weren't realistically able to shoot at the true technical ISO of 126 or let's say 125 under a lot of situations, because high contrast would mean that you would just clip your highlights and blow them out and then you'd lose all that detail. Harman Phoenix 2 having a higher true ISO means that that does explain some of the benefits you see with this new emulsion, and it directly results in some of them. But combine that with the increased latitude, and that means that if you want to shoot at say 160, 140, 125 to get a slightly cleaner image, you can do that a lot more easily than you can with Harman Phoenix without it being essentially mandatory, where so many people just commit to shooting Phoenix 1 at 100 or 125 like myself, because you kind of need that to get good image quality, but then you have to play around with the dynamic range and exposure latitude to make sure you're maximizing your image quality without throwing away your highlight information. Here, it's more of an optional to your taste thing, which represents or signifies the overall improvements to the emulsion as a complete package. Phoenix 2 still doesn't employ an orange mask, so there is going to be some limit to its ability to be lab scanned. It is going to require a little bit more work than something like Gold, Fuji 200, Superior or the like, and RA4 printing will still require a bit of an extra workflow. Though from what I've seen of some lab scans, the overall improvements to this film do make it a lot more amenable to lab scanning, which should result in fewer comments like, Phoenix is great if you scan it yourself, or don't bring it to XLab because they don't know what they're doing. It should be more amenable to a broader range of scans, which means more people are going to get good results and more people are going to like it, but it's still not quite as there as it would be if it had an orange mask. As highly improved as Phoenix 2 is, it's still not quite as good as your typical consumer-grade color-negative film. I compared Phoenix 2 to Pro Image 100, which is your standard color-negative 100-speed film, nothing too fancy there, and there are quite a few differences. I mean, the difference in grain is immediately apparent, and the color chart for Pro Image is a lot more accurate and faithful. I don't want to diminish the improvements that Harman have made with the second generation film. It is still a massive improvement over Phoenix 1, but I just want to drive home the point that we're not kind of at Kodak Gold Portra levels of quality just yet. That will take further iterations and a bit more time. Compared to Phoenix 1, the base is a lot more prone to turning purple. I've found that even when using fresh chemicals, I'm getting a slightly purple tint to my base straight out of the tank. And I believe that this is due to some kind of a change that Harman have made over the last number of months with Phoenix 1 that has been carried over to Phoenix 2. I never ended up making a video about it, which was meant to be the kind of big hurrah finale to the mastering Harman Phoenix series, but I came up with my own E6 process variant, which Harman allowed me to call PR9, Phoenix Reversal 9, and that stopped working when the base started coming out purple with fresh chemicals. And obviously they don't care about my process, that's fine. And I did show in a previous video that the purple base doesn't affect your image quality in any way. But I did develop a roll of Harman Phoenix and a roll of Phoenix 2 in the same tank at one point, and the Phoenix came out clear, but the Phoenix 2 came out slightly tinted purple. Not as much as I've seen with lab rolls of Phoenix 1, but it is worth noting that that will have an impact on the suitability of this film for reversal processing. Frankly, although a lot of people are into the whole idea of Harman reinvesting a ton of money and getting massive financial backing to expand their manufacturing so that they can produce new color film and, you know, be one of the players that's trying to take Kodak off the top of the pedestal, it is still a decently expensive film, and in some markets it's too expensive for a lot of people just to try. Though I will say that given its limitations are so significantly reduced compared to Phoenix 1, it's something I could a lot more easily recommend to people without caveats and warnings and be careful and don't do this and make sure you do this that way and don't let this person scan it. It's a lot more easy to recommend, but it's still quite a bit more expensive than other competing films that benefit from, again, the R&D cost being split over millions more rolls, as well as generally greater economies of scale being produced in larger quantities for longer periods of time. So although the money is, for the price, you know, it's justified, it is still more expensive than other competing films, and not everybody is going to be willing to pay for that. And lastly, the greatest tragedy here is that this film does completely and wholly replace Harman Phoenix 1. That film is only going to be available now as stocks last. That's the end of Phoenix 1. We're moving on to Phoenix 2. And I think for the diehards, that's going to be quite sad. So those are my thoughts on Harman Phoenix 2, the second generation colour film coming out of Mobberley in the UK from Harman Photo. This does represent an absolutely massive improvement in the overall emulsion design, and it's clear that they've learned a lot about colour film manufacturing since working on Phoenix 1. The overall film is a much cleaner, tighter package, with every single weakness of Phoenix being tackled to some degree. Sharpness, grain, resolution, contrast, dynamic range, exposure latitude, amenability to scanning have all been tackled in one way or another. And that represents an overall much nicer, well-rounded film without compromising on the character. It still looks like Phoenix, even if it does have a slightly cooler color palette. It still has the same kind of vibe to it. I mean, I took a bunch of shots for my first roll and brought them to the Mobberley tour, and I had some prints made, but before I went, I sent some of those prints, or photos of some of those prints, to my friends to just ask them what they thought, and every one of them correctly guessed they were Phoenix, even if they didn't know it was Phoenix 2. And that shows that they've kind of managed to keep the look while making an overall more performant film, which I think is the best case scenario. That's kind of what I was going for again in my project last year, trying to get the same look with higher image quality, and now you've got that straight out of the box. It really does represent a massive step here. That said, my comparisons do show that there is still plenty of room to go, plenty of room for improvement, especially in the grain department, but the resolution is vastly improved. Dynamic range and exposure latitude are very good, if not on the level of, you know, typical consumer grade films yet, especially Pro Image, which is kind of a gold standard, as I spoke about in another recent video. But color reproduction is the other big thing that's going to need to be worked on. And from there, they can hopefully branch out to other films. But they are already working on the successor to Phoenix II, as well as the successor to that. So we'll be seeing results from those in due course down the line. I want to thank Harman Photo again for sending me so many rolls so I could make this content for launch. And I'd like to thank you for watching, but that's all I have to say for this video for today. Could you make Phoenix II better though by playing around with development? I guess we'll talk about that another day. So stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.